These days, most people think of black cats when they hear the term familiars in connection with witchcraft. For some, it invokes a wonderful sense of awe and knowing and mystery. For others, the idea is similar to LARPing. That's live action role playing for my non nerds out there. And still for others, it triggers feelings of fear or unease. If you're listening to this episode, my guess is that you're in the first group. Hey, I'm April, and we are on a witchful journey. Let's see. Anything in terms of updates for you? Actually, yes. I got my first coffee the other day, which came from Kelsey. She added a note that says, "Love you and your podcast." Now, in the interest of being fully honest, she is my sister, and she deserves as much of a shout out as anyone. Kelsey, thank you so much for your support, and love you too. And just before I started recording this episode, because life can make me late sometimes, a lovely anonymous human chose to show some love and support the podcast. If you're listening, thank you. I appreciate you so much, and you rock. And I'm going to try not to be too giddy for the rest of the episode. No, but seriously, thank you both. I also want to share that we're just shy of 200 followers across all platforms. Last I knew, there were 196 of you. The number may not seem big, but I started at 0, and I do little to no marketing of the podcast at the moment. So that's pretty cool, and I appreciate all of you. I also want to let you know that my significant other and I are planning on going to the Champlain Valley Psychic Expo here in Vermont, which is August 9th and 10th. I'm super excited because it's the 3rd annual one, and I've been wanting to go since they started doing this. We'll only be going to attend, so it's not like I'm going to be there working a booth or anything. But I do hope to have some experiences that I'll be able to share with you in the episode following the expo. I haven't pulled a card for us in probably a few weeks, right? Today, I'm pulling from the Motherpiece Round Tarot deck. This deck is from the early 80s and was lent to me by my friend Lisa. I know some folks are very particular about tarot decks and have a bunch of rules surrounding them, which we'll dive into at some point. But holding this deck in my hands, I feel honored to be holding a deck with what feels like an old, incredibly wise energy. So let's see what it has for us. The 9 of Discs. Solitary creative work, accomplished healer. The number 9 and the word accomplished suggest an encouragement to embrace the abundance and independence that have been gained from previous efforts. Being an accomplished healer requires a level of wisdom that is only gained through experience, but recognizing that nothing is ever complete. It's about a cycle of rebirth in an upward motion. It's not bad, it's just the way things work. That solitary creative work, though, it's not time to go out and be part of the group yet. It's highlighting personal autonomy, with the space to be able to continue growing that creative work. I'm not sure if that card was meant for me or for one of you, but if it does resonate, let me know. Familiars. The full term for familiars is familiar spirits. It's been shortened to just familiars over time, but the word spirits was originally in there to differentiate between a person that was familiar to you and a demon or spirit that takes the form of, in most cases, an animal to aid a witch. One of the really interesting things about familiars is that, historically, they were really only known by that term in Europe in the Middle Ages. Primarily in England, it appears. There are some accounts of trials in Germany, Iceland, France, and Ireland that refer to a witch's use of a familiar, but it appears that it was not at all common. The first mention of an evil familiar spirit was in 1324 in Ireland, when noblewoman Alice Kettler was accused of witchcraft and of having a demon lover by the name of Robin, who often took the form of an animal, or, and I quote, an Ethiopian man. It seems that no other mention of familiars have surfaced until about 200 years later. English depictions of familiars were heavily influenced by the witch trials, fueling an already overwhelming fear of those who practiced the ancient indigenous traditions. In the Middle Ages, Europe viewed familiars as evil spirits or demons that usually took the form of animals. These animals were thought to assist witches in casting spells, gathering information, spying on others, and making potions. They were said to provide psychic ability to the witch by being the witch's eyes and ears. Common claims during the witch trials were that familiars were kept in pots or baskets lined with wool, and were fed a variety of foods, such as milk, bread, meat, and blood. But not just any blood. No, the familiars fed on the blood of the witch they were serving, and not just for funsies. You see, a witch was said to have made a pact with the devil in order for her, or him, to have magical powers. Familiars were basically seen as the devil's helpers, if not the devil himself, and as such, required the witch's blood on occasion to keep that pact. There was a common way for accusers and interrogators to find out if a witch had a familiar, even if they hadn't actually seen the familiar. The telltale sign was a witch's mark. They're often mentioned in the trial records and were used as undeniable proof that a suspected witch indeed fed a familiar, which ultimately resulted in conviction and often execution. What did these witches' marks look like? Well, today we would call them moles, or warts, or skin tags. In medieval Europe, if you were a witch, they were called teats, and you only needed a single one to find yourself being convicted of witchcraft. One example was during the notorious Pendle witch trials in England in 1612. Elizabeth Device was accused of witchcraft, and during her trial, her own 9-year-old daughter, Jeanette, was brought before the court. Jeanette claimed that her mother, Elizabeth, had a familiar named Ball, who would take the form of a brown dog and have conversations with Elizabeth about the people she was accused of murdering by use of witchcraft. Elizabeth was found guilty. Her son, James Device, was also accused, and Jeanette claimed he conjured up a black dog familiar to help him kill someone. That, apparently, was sufficient evidence to find James guilty. There are other claims that were made, which included a hare and a black cat as other familiars mentioned during these trials. The accused were searched for witches' marks, all of which led to conviction with a side of execution. Another example of the mention of a familiar in trial records that I found rather ridiculous is the trial of Gwen Furch Ellis, a cloth spinner, herbalist, and healer in Wales in 1594. Gwen never confessed to having a familiar, but it counted as a mark against her in court when the local bailiff testified that while testing Gwen, one of his companions struck her, resulting in the companion breaking his arm, and when the bailiff demanded a drink, Gwen served him a jug of ale that contained a large fly. Neither the bailiff nor any of his companions were able to remove the fly from the ale, and they ultimately suspected that the fly was Gwen's familiar. Gwen was convicted and hanged in October of 1594. We'll dive deeper into witch marks and the Pendle witch trials and Gwen Furch Ellis as time goes on. I promise. So, how on earth did one go about acquiring a familiar? According to British accounts during the Middle Ages, there were 3 main ways that a witch would meet their familiar. One was the familiar spirit would spontaneously appear to the individual. This would happen for both witches and those who were called cunning folk. We'll talk a little bit about them in a moment. The familiar was given to an individual by a predecessor. This would also happen for those who were called cunning folk. Or the level of struggle that the individual was going through, usually for physical survival, was so great that it prompted a spirit to offer assistance through their powers. Also would happen to cunning folk. Now, cunning folk were the people who were generally allowed to use their magic and have their own familiars, which it seems were not considered to be evil spirits, but benevolent fairies. I say allowed because there was a Witchcraft Act, in effect, that stated that only those who communicated with evil spirits in any way could be prosecuted for witchcraft. The cunning folk were primarily healers, herbalists, fortune tellers, midwives, and sometimes detectors of thieves. The practices of cunning folk weren't perceived as harmful because often, especially in more rural areas, their magic was needed in order to keep their communities healthy and safe. Their familiars were their assistants when it came to diagnosing an illness, protecting the community, and during divination sessions. The work they did wasn't necessarily encouraged by the crown or the church, but it was tolerated. Witch or cunning folk, generally after meeting a familiar spirit, the individual would make a pact with the spirit that would last anywhere from a few weeks to a decade or more. The pact created a type of bond where there was a mutual ability to make requests of or summon each other. It was said to be so strong that one common belief was that if you burned a witch's familiar, it would destroy the witch's power. Another belief was that a witch couldn't die until she, or he, found someone to accept her, or his, familiar. Over time, accounts of familiars showed preferences for smaller and smaller animals, until the claims centered mainly around little white mice. There are many different ways that have been recorded from various trials about how a witch would conjure up or work with their familiar. One claim was that working with a familiar was for the purpose of healing, seeking, and learning, which is probably the most accurate of the bunch. Some claims were that the familiar appeared whenever, and that the individual had no control in that regard, which also seems to be pretty accurate if you zoom out and look at other cultures. Some claimed that familiars could be sold as charms, which, if you remember the episode on voodoo, isn't too far off. Spirits can be stored in items and sold or given to others as charms. Along those same lines, there were also claims that a familiar spirit could be conjured up during a ritual and stored in an item, kind of like a Horcrux, until needed. These particular familiars were called agathons, which could be stored in rings, bottles, talismans, or even take the form of a human. Some claimed that they learned how to summon a familiar through methods found in books, while others claimed they kneeled down in a circle and prayed to Satan. Familiars often had pretty standard pet or human names, like Tom, Will, Jack, Dog, Boy, and Dandy. Every so often in the witch trial records, though, you come across names like Pyewacket, Grizzle and Greedy Gut, Vinegar Tom, and Peck in the Crown. Of course, the vast majority of confessions during any witch trials were made under torture, and we'll eventually talk about the why in another episode. What matters right now is that many of the more creative names for familiars very likely were planted as seeds in the heads of the accused by their torturers, and they ultimately confessed to names that they had never even heard of before being arrested for suspicion of witchcraft. What's more is that Witchfinder General Matthew Hopkins, who was not bestowed that title by Parliament, mind you, he claimed that title for himself, decided that the names of familiars of suspected witches alone was proof enough of their existence. I think we can all see how that would be problematic. A prime example of the problem that this created can be seen during the Salem witch trials in Massachusetts. Few of the trial records actually have accounts of familiar animals as practice, but one dog was tried, convicted, and hanged because a man was charged with magically encouraging the dog to attack another person. Another problem were the quote-unquote visions that a few of the accusers claimed to have had of familiars belonging to suspected witches. Back in Europe, there was mass slaughtering of animals that were suspected of being someone's familiar. And some suggest that the slaughter of cats in particular led to an increase in outbreaks of diseases that were carried by rodents, which led to plague-level sicknesses. I can't find anything definitive that necessarily supports that theory, but it's an interesting one, since many accused witches were blamed for bringing sickness down on their communities. I mentioned the Witchcraft Act a little bit ago. I want to go dig a little deeper there to give you an idea of why familiars were so feared. You see, in 1542, the Witchcraft Act was put into effect, and it stated that all witchcraft was a felony and was punishable by death. In 1563, more clarification was added, stating that only those who caused harm through witchcraft were punishable by death. In 1604, the scope was widened on the number of witchcraft-related offenses that were punishable by death. And among that new list of things was communication or dealings with evil spirits. Working with evil spirits was made a capital offense, and the document mentioned that familiars were a witch's demonic companion. Where did that idea come from? Well, King James I was the one who introduced the 1604 version of the Witchcraft Act. He was Protestant. We'll get into why that's important in a moment. First, I want to mention that in the Middle Ages and early modern Europe, which spans from the 5th to 15th century as the Middle Ages, and the 15th to 18th century as early modern, domestic animals as companions were very rare unless you were nobility. For any other household, animals always had a purpose. So for a commoner, to have an animal simply as a companion was odd, especially if that commoner was old, very poor, or lived on the outskirts of town. And those accused of witchcraft were, generally, at least one of those things. But back to King James. Many of the people back in the Middle Ages and early modern period were religious. I won't get into why that is right now, but since that was the case, and different veins of Christianity were very widespread, of course King James I was religious in some way. So he read or heard the Bible. In the KJV Bible, it states, in Leviticus 19:31, "Give no regard to mediums or familiar spirits. Do not seek after them, to be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God." In Deuteronomy 18:10 to 18:12, "There shall not be found among you anyone that maketh his son or his daughter to pass through the fire, or that useth divination, or an observer of times, or an enchanter, or a witch, or a charmer, or a consulter with familiar spirits, or a wizard, or a necromancer. For all that do these things are an abomination unto the Lord. And because of these abominations, the Lord thy God doth drive them out from before thee." And in 2 Chronicles 33:6, "And he caused his children to pass through the fire in the valley of the son of Hinnom. Also he observed times, and used enchantments, and used witchcraft, and dealt with a familiar spirit, and with wizards. He wrought much evil in the sight of the Lord, to provoke him to anger." There are plenty of other mentions that speak against witchcraft, familiars, and so on, and the point that is trying to be driven home with all of it is that familiar spirits are demons, or at the very least abominations, which are pretty much the same thing according to the Bible, and that they will do anything that they can to trick you by speaking through animals, or what is referred to as a human spiritist, acting like a dead ancestor, just trying to pass on spiritual wisdom. Oh yeah, did I mention that KJV stands for King James Version? As in the King James Version of the Bible? And yes, that would be the same King James I that introduced the 1604 version of the Witchcraft Act. The first publication of the King James Bible was 1611. He also wrote a dissertation titled Demonology in 1597 while he was King James VI of Scotland. That dissertation includes his classification of demons and the study of demonology, and very clearly endorses witch hunts in a Christian society. See, the church sought to convert all pagans to Christianity. It was convert or die. It was allow yourself to be controlled or die. The ancient beliefs and practices had to be made to look evil so that fear would be rampant and deep and make people easier to control. They couldn't just wipe out all of the pagan belief systems, though. They had to tweak them. So what we know as familiars went from being sacred guides and companions to being evil spirits and demons. And it had all been going on for well over 1,000 years by the time King James made it into the picture. so I'm certainly not placing blame on him. Or not all of it. But let's talk for a bit about what other cultures' beliefs were when it came to these things that we know as familiars. As Europe in the Middle Ages and the early modern period was raging about demonic spirits, other parts of the world saw these spirits and creatures as protectors, guides, and divine interventionists. Other parts of the world were much more one with nature because they still had their indigenous traditions that went far, far back. One definition of these familiars or spirit guides comes from Pierre A. Riffard, who says that the spirit guide is a double or alter ego of the individual. It may have an independent life of its own, but remains closely linked to the individual. And it can be an animal. The Goldie in Siberia have tutelary spirits, or protectors, spirit guides. These spirits choose the shaman, and there's a spiritual tie that's similar to marriage. The tutelary spirit teaches the shaman and has helper spirits that are made available to aid the shaman as needed. The indigenous people of Australia, studied by A.P. Elkin, have medicine men that send their familiar spirits, a spirit animal, totem, something along those lines, to gather necessary and relevant information while he is in a trance or sleep state. Ancient Rome saw these familiar spirits as guardian angel types, guarding their homes and property. In ancient Greece, they were personal spirits that guided a person's actions and important decisions. The famous Greek philosopher Socrates wrote of having a personal spirit who he said guided his conscience and helped keep him from making rash decisions. Many Eastern religions build and maintain shrines that are dedicated to protector spirits. These shrines are tiny, brightly painted, and elaborate, and they're called spirit houses. If you've never seen one, go look it up. They're beautiful. There are many cultures that have totem animals, which are helpers from the spirit realm that assist a shaman. Some include Africa, Asia, Australia, parts of Eastern and Western Europe, and probably one of my favorites, Native American. They're referred to as power animals, which I love. These power animals reflect certain qualities or characteristics, depending on the animal, and are benevolent but can have mischievous streaks. And they can be any animal: butterfly, deer, buffalo, turtle, rabbit, fox, coyote. Everyone wants the bear or the eagle or the wolf to be their power animal. But there is beauty in knowing and comfort in ones that you wouldn't expect. Some people are of the opinion that familiars and spirit guides are not the same, which is fine. Modern spiritual people and witches don't have to agree 100% on them as long as no one's trying to harm anyone for having a different belief. The cool part about it is that whether familiar or spirit guide, it's meant to look different from person to person because none of us are the same. So why would any of our guides be the same, right? The nature of our spiritual connection with familiars should vary greatly from person to person. Anyway, many modern witches see their household pet as their familiar, as in their magical animal companion. Some prefer to use the terms like teacher, messenger, or just companion. Some see familiars as extremely important to their practice, while others don't see a need for them at all, with plenty of folks who fall somewhere in between the two opinions. It seems, though, that the bond with a pet and the bond with a familiar are different and certainly feel different. Familiars are said to generally not mess up your altar space if you have one. And the reason for this is because they're your ally, the guardian of your spiritual and ritual space. They are energy channelers, sensitive to psychic vibrations, magic, and extrasensory perceptions. They help connect you with nature and the spirit realm. Familiars don't always have to be pets, though, or even animals. The main thing is that there has to be a deep, special connection and resonance with the witch. Sometimes it can be in spirit form, an entity that the witch calls on for assistance or guidance that usually has an ancestral or past life connection. More often, though, it is a living animal, whether domestic or wild, that finds the witch. You may have multiple familiars. A good way to tell is if an animal acts strangely connected to you without showing the same kind of connection with any other human. Maybe one sprung to mind as soon as I said that. Maybe not. Other common signs are that your familiar seems to understand you, not just when you speak, but on an almost telepathic or energetic level. They motivate you, whether you feel motivated by their presence, or they actively draw you toward your spiritual space, or do something that brings your attention to your craft or your magic. Your spells may seem more powerful when they're around. There may be a heightened energy in the space, or they feel as though they possess a restorative aura. They may show interest in your magical space, maybe by sitting next to your spiritual books or napping near your altar space. Maybe you find that a certain animal accompanies you on nature walks, or leaves gifts by your doorstep, or consistently visits you while you're in the garden. If none of these ring true for you, but you'd like to find a familiar, try figuring out what type of animal your familiar might be. In order to explore spiritual connections with animals, you simply need to just raise your awareness about them. Consider yourself. Do you prefer groups, solitude, cold, wintry settings, or hot, humid places? What are your food choices like? Do you prefer to be dry, or do you love being in the water? Are you playful and adventurous, or laid back, calm? What animals fall into the same categories as you? Which animals do you feel drawn to? Which animals seem to be drawn to you? It's also suggested to consider symbolic meanings of animals as well, as that can be quite crucial. Some common ones are cats, especially black cats, known for their independence and historically believed to be able to walk between worlds or realms, associated with intuition, flexibility, and psychic abilities. Owls, like Athena's sacred owl, associated with wisdom and knowledge, deep insight, and being able to see things that others cannot. Foxes, associated with cunning and adaptability, and spiders, associated with patience and destiny. Personally, I've had a few familiars in my life, even before I knew they were familiars. Almost always cats, which makes sense because I adore cats, obviously, since we have 3 of them. And I've always felt a strong connection with cats, even as a child. Though I was quite drawn to a couple of rats as a teenager. They were the sweetest things, always either hanging out on my shoulder or in my hoodie pocket when I was home. But the cats have always been different. My first one was as a young child. His name was Casper. Very lovey, always slept on my bed if he could, usually wrapped around my head. He seemed to sense any time I was upset about something because he'd come and sit with me, and would only get up once I felt better. He was originally a stray. My second one came after he passed, and his name was Cyrus. Stocky and just as cuddly as Casper. He acted exactly the same way, too. And he was also originally a stray. Then there was Orion. Black, fluffy, sweet, but such a dope. Anytime I was doing something creative or reading, and especially when I was pregnant with my oldest child, he was right there and gave off a protective vibe. He came to us from a friend who found him and brought him to us, presumably also originally a stray. And then there was CJ, who my significant other and I adopted because she was well past her prime, and the thought of her staying at the Humane Society didn't sit well with me. I hadn't been planning on getting a cat at the time, but there she was. She would follow me around the backyard, never wandering far, but always when I was harvesting mint or exploring the different plants that were growing, or while I was deep into studying herbs, she would sleep under my desk. She would insist on sleeping next to me, or on top of me. If I was sitting on the floor studying, she would sit with me. But she also liked to sit with Nate, and our little running joke, because she would insist, was, "I sit with you? No, I sit with you." And there's never seemed to be any adjustment period with her. I'm not about to assume that any of our current kittens will turn out to take that open spot, but I will say that when we got them, the plan was only 2 kittens. We came home with 3. Thanks so much for tuning in and hanging out with me today. In the next episode, we're going to talk about grounding techniques and tiger's eye, both of which I love, love, love. If you enjoyed this episode and don't want to miss out on future episodes, hit those like and follow buttons. I always have so much more waiting to be shared with you. For now, you can find me on Facebook, Witchful Journey Podcast, on Instagram at a_witchful_journey. For those of you that need a reminder, the underscores are the spaces with the little lines at the bottom. On BlueSky at awitchfuljourney.bsky.social, and on YouTube, A Witchful Journey. I enjoy hearing from listeners, so if you pop in, say hi, leave me a rating, or if you're really feeling it, a review. If you'd like to contribute, donate, or buy my next podcast coffee, whatever you want to call it, check out A Witchful Journey on Ko-fi. That's KO-FI. You can also send stories or experiences to awitchfuljourney@gmail.com. I'm April, and we are on a witchful journey.